Alrighty, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about validity, which is something we can use to assess the causal claims of a research article, research design, the methods. And we've seen validity prior when we were talking about measurement. Remember, the qualities of measurement are reliability and validity. And so we're going to first review what we were talking about when we were talking about validity in regards to measurement, and then we're going to introduce how validity is talked about in forms of causation. So validity overall is a way in which we can assess the quality of research, whether that be in the methods portion when we're gathering our raw material, and in the measurement portion where we're gathering our raw material and we're trying to conceptualize, okay, what topics are we talking about? What are operational definitions and how do we measure that? So it can be in that realm, or it can be in, okay, this research article's findings say this causes this. All right, let's talk about the validity of this research and whether or not it's strong, meaning that we can make those causal claims, or it's weak, that those causal claims are actually, we shouldn't take as strongly. And so it's a way for us to both critique research and also to be transparent when we're doing research about what might be the strengths and weaknesses of our own research. So it's important to talk about validity, like in your method section, when you're assessing how your research went. So first, for the review. These are all forms of validity in relation to measurement. Remember the process of coming up with a construct and then turning that construct into something that's more specific and specific and specific until we get into an operational definition and are able to actually do the measurements, right? And so what that process, if that process is logical, if that process makes sense, then it has face validity, which we talked about the second week. And then if the constructs that we derived our measurements from, if they relate in ways that are consistent with our hypothesis, then there's construct validity. Another form of validity is criterion-related validity, and that's when we can compare a measure to some external criteria. So if we're trying to measure like mental health, if we are relating that to like the DSM-5 and the criteria for certain mental illnesses. So you might not see this external criteria too much in criminology, but it is in like psychology, which obviously intersects. And so then there's content validity, which really gets to, here's another review. We're going to think about the two qualities of variables that we really need is it to be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So content validity is talking about the exhaustive, ensuring that we have the full range of whatever that variable is, that we're not excluding any observations that we could be making. And then when we talked about validity prior, we also talked about how there's the two qualities of measurement, reliability and validity. So reliability is consistency, but validity is actually ensuring that our measure is the truth. So I gave you the example of a police officer who has a speedometer, and if the speedometer is saying that someone's going 70 miles per hour, but in actuality they're going 65, then that means there's not strong validity. There's reliability. Every time that a 65 mile per hour car goes past, it'll say 70, but it's off by 5 points, right? But if we had another police officer there who was also using the speedometer and was getting a different read, then that would increase the validity. So oftentimes we use multiple measures to increase validity. So we went through all of the types of validity that occur in measurement. And now we're going to go through all of the types of validity that occur in causal spaces. And so you can see there's some overlap in generalizability with construct validity and external validity. And that makes sense, because if we think about the theoretical constructs that we're trying to create measurements for, we want to make sure that those like more specific measurements can be generalized to this larger, higher, more abstract plane as well. And so that's a form of generalizability, saying that it is not just this specific instance in which this makes sense, but that we can generalize it to the theoretical level as well, right? And then external validity and statistical conclusion validity and internal validity we'll get into, but external validity has to do with generalizability as well. And then statistical conclusion and internal validity have to do with bias. So we're going to get into that now. So like I said, prior validity allows us to assess the truth of statements by considering threats to validity. And we want to, when we're saying a cause and effect, X causes Y, we want to ensure that is actually true, that we're not spewing something that's not blasphemous, that's not true. And so there are certain threats that obviously would exist just with how research is. No research is perfect, that you're going to be balancing strengths and weaknesses of validity with all of them. And so we're really trying to be transparent about those strengths and weaknesses. And validity helps us reason, okay, why might our findings be a little bit incorrect, right? In what cases does it not apply? So bias is threats that are related to systematic and non-systematic bias. So systematic bias would be like sampling issues. Like we talked about in the last lecture, if we're trying to say that being a football player causes domestic violence, there's inherently a sampling bias that is occurring there, right? Because there's a selection process by which you become an NFL player. So you can't necessarily get rid of that systematic bias, unless you do randomization or something like that. So, and bias is also when we're perceiving things that are not there, or there's external things that are influencing our study that we're not aware of, like confounding variables is what that's called. And so internal validity and statistical conclusion validity are in that. And then generalizability is, can we apply this to other real world examples? So first we're going to get into internal validity, and recall, so we're first going to talk about bias, and then we're going to get into generalizability. So internal validity is when there's the relationship between two variables is actually from those two variables and not due to random or systematic error. And so threats occur when these two variables arise from some other third thing, like I said prior, a confounder. So this example is drug users sentenced to probation over prison recidivate less. And so that could just be because of prison, but there might be some other external variables that are influencing that, like the likelihood for drug users to go to probation versus prison, or the likelihood of the selection of people to become drug users, right? Or they're more likely to then be incarcerated and whatnot. So some threats to internal validity, one is instrumentation. So if there's some change that occurs in how we measure what happens. A very tangible example of this is I wanted to understand how bail reform in New Jersey impacts whether or not people actually get detained. Does bail reform actually decrease the amount of people in jail, right? That's what it's supposed to do. But the way that the system was reworked through bail reform, so I can't compare my pre-test to my post-test because there's like this whole different type of court processing that occurs. And so this is an example of instrumentation when the independent variable that you're concerned with, bail reform, actually influences how the measurement occurs. And this happens a lot in the criminal justice system and is a difficulty in having causal methods. And so the next thing is statistical regression. So whenever we're doing statistical regression, we are averaging. We are not saying that this equals this, like we have that specific number. We're usually using the average treatment effect of our findings are in averages. And so if there's any anomalies or instances in which there's extreme scores, then they're going to highly disproportionately affect the average. And so if we are like testing a drug rehabilitation program and like a lot of people do or a few people do really, really well, then when we are trying to analyze the impact of that program, we might be overstating it because of those small anomalies. There's also selection bias. So if we're not using random assignment, like we talked about in the experiments lecture, then we need to think about, okay, is there a selection for how people are coming into our research? So if we're implementing a survey that's voluntary, then the people who are likely to fill out that survey maybe might have like a high level of wanting to be a good citizen, or like filling out forms. Like there's a bunch of selection that goes into that where we're not randomly assigning someone to do a survey. And so this is a really big threat to internal validity that we often struggle with because we can't necessarily force people to do things, right? So that's on the front end of like getting research subjects and dealing with our sampling. And then on the back end, if we are doing a study that is longitudinal, where we're taking multiple observations, we might lose people along the way. Or if we're just doing a study where we're even taking a snapshot, people may say, yes, I want to participate in your study, and then they drop off. And so there might be a process by which those people drop off that we're not understanding or reviewing. Maybe those people have certain variables that are part of like how the outcome is. And so it can really affect our results too, because then we have to exclude those people from our research, and they could have been like very important findings. So other threats to validity are if we're not super defined in what our causal time order is. This can happen a lot if we're dealing with larger units of analysis, like if we're dealing with how city budgets affect like police deployment, right? Would we want to do the city budget the year prior or 3 years prior? There may be some time lag into how that might influence. So we really need to think about the causal time order and make sure at least the independent variable comes before the dependent variable. So in this case, city budgets, that we're getting the city budget from the year prior to the police deployment data are dependent variable. But even when we're doing that, we need to think about like time lag and other forms of time as well. And so then there's also this sense of, and these last 4 threats to internal validity all have to do with when you're implementing your research, especially if you're dealing with human subjects, how are they engaging with the research? And that can really have, and like how are they self-aware of it? And that can really heavily influence your observations. So there might be diffusion. So there was a research experiment of the Kingswood study, which I think I mentioned in the last lecture, but there was this closing of the Kingswood's like rehabilitative school. So some people were getting a rehabilitative program and some were not because of the school closing, but they were in the same time period. But there was some conversation between those two groups. So if there's conversation between those two groups, then maybe the person who's not getting the treatment is getting a little bit of the treatment because they heard from a person who's in the treatment group about what the treatment is. So that's called diffusion or imitation of treatments. And so that's why you sort of want to keep the experimental group and the control group separate, but that's not always feasible, especially in criminal justice settings, right? Then there's compensatory treatment. So this is something that is a barrier for why people would want research to exist in the first place. And that's that there may be some people who are like, no, that's not fair. You're giving this treatment to this other group, and I would like to be in that group. So those exceptions that we have to make, or those sort of people who advocate for themselves, which is great, actually like really is not super helpful for the research side of things. So you always have to balance, if I'm doing an experiment with a program, like there are going to be people who get this and don't get this. So one way to go about it is to create a waiting list where eventually they'll get the program, but just not now. And that's one way to deal with that. Then there's compensatory rivalry. So the control group that's deprived of the program, the treatment, they might compensate by trying to work harder. And so that would reduce the amount of treatment effect that we see because they're trying to get the outcomes that we're studying. Then there's also demoralization. So the feeling that there's deprivation amongst the control group and that they just are giving up. So in actuality, the treatment effect would be much higher than we think because our control group is testing lower in the outcome than we would have thought. And so this, if there are threats to internal validity, then the conclusions that we get from the experiment may not reflect what actually went on in the experiment. There are other things, and that's why it's really important to be transparent when you're implementing your experiment. What was wrong? Like, was there conversations between the control group and the experimental group, and being very transparent about that. So other threats to validity are history. So there may just be, in the course of events, sometimes there's just historical trends. And so, and other historical factors that could influence the outcomes that we're interested in that we're not accounting for. So it's like history is a confounder in this instance. Also, in sort of a similar vein, people are constantly growing. So they're always maybe getting better, or maybe getting more insight or self-awareness. So especially when we're measuring outcomes that are like a little mushy, like satisfaction or self-esteem or something like that, if we have observations at multiple points in time, then we could also be not factoring in like just a general trend of growth as well. And then the process of actually testing people and retesting, if we're, for example, giving the same test over and over again, then our subjects may become privy of what answers we want, or they may be sick and tired of us testing them, so they may just choose whatever is convenient and not even think about when they're filling out a form. So testing and retesting process, thinking about how we can make sure that our forms are a little bit different from pre-test to post-test, and that there's a sense of wanting and buy-in to fill out the form. So if people are paid to fill it out, maybe they'll be better about responding in a way that's accurate, right? So there are ways to get around these things, but we should always think about these threats to internal validity. They're sort of like a checklist when we're designing our research to make sure that we're reducing these levels of bias, because essentially all of this is bias. It's external factors that are influencing our research that we're not controlling for, and that are going to influence the outcome, the dependent variable that we're concerned with. Okay, so the other aspect is statistical conclusion validity, which this is essentially that we are making sure that what we're seeing is actually what is happening in real life in a way, and that our two variables are actually related to each other. And so essentially, we just want to make sure that there's enough sampling, there's enough people to show that our statistical conclusions are actually consistent with the reality, are valid. And so threats to statistical conclusion validity is when our sample size is small. More cases allow us to detect small differences, and less cases only allows us to detect large differences because we're dealing with averages, right? And so we need to have a large number of subjects, and we need to make sure that we're ensuring that there's enough of those observations throughout our pre-test and post-testing as well. So now we're going to talk about generalizability and get to construct validity and external validity. And so these are problems of generalizing from the specific context of our research site to the larger constructs we're interested in, the larger population, our sampling frame. So construct validity, like I talked about, is okay, we have specified through our measurement or our conceptualization and operationalization process what we're measuring and how that measurement represents this larger construct. And so if the hypothesis we had up here is consistent with our findings down here, then that means that we can generalize to the larger theoretical level. And so an example of this that your book provides is close supervision of officers might actually create more tickets because they're being observed, whereas the Kansas City Prevention Patrol experiment also created police visibility. So if you want to look more into those examples, you can in the book, but I'm not going to explain them. So threats to construct validity are when we our process of operationalization and conceptualization is not good, when that specific nature, that the process we went through was not, like, we didn't deal with the measurement validity portions that we talked about in the beginning. And we also really need to understand how much treatment is required to produce the change in the dependent variable. So we need to really understand, okay, this is the difference from our findings, but is that actually a good difference that's tangible in the real world? So external validity has to do with whether our research findings can be replicated in another space. So do the findings apply equally in different contexts? If we're doing a study in Kansas City, would it apply the same in Indianapolis and Pittsburgh? If it does, then that means that we have good external validity. And so a way to get at the threat of external validity is to do replications. So then there's this sort of issue because the more controlled and experimental we are and specific about manipulating the space and the design, like within an experimental setting, the less external validity we might have unless we do replication. So there's this sort of balance, this diabolical dilemma that John Eck presents, in which internal validity and external validity are like balanced against each other in a way. And so it's good for explanatory studies that are exploring more a sense of things. It's good for them to have a good sense of internal validity, whereas applied studies, we want to have more of better external validity because we want to have those things in application. So as I said, we're sort of balancing validity and reliability. And sometimes we'll have good internal reliability. Sometimes we'll have good validity. And it's just sort of understanding the differences between them. And like we said before, reliability is consistency, stability, and then validity is measuring what is actually claimed, being able to have these causes actually be valid. So an example of this is if drug use causes crime. So which would come first? You need to make sure that the people that you're observing first had drug use, right? And then created crime. So oftentimes that may not be the case, and there may be prior crime before the drug use, or there may be like more of a pattern, right? And so that creates issues of validity. And so there may be there's an internal validity threat when there's some other cause that we're not observing that influences both drug use and crime, like say trauma, or let's say poverty. And so we need to control and account for those variables if we're going to have good internal validity. And then we need to make sure that our measurements, when we're doing the conceptualization and the operationalization, going from general to more specific, from the construct to down to the measurements, that is consistent. So what drug use are we talking about? What crime are we talking about? We want to be more specific in those instances in order to ensure that we have construct validity. And so then there's also a sense of we want to make sure there's not any threats to internal validity, such as history, right? So if there's some policy that's external to our experiment that's influencing the amount of drugs being used, or that is heavily reducing crime, then that's going to be something we need to account for in our experiment as well. So I hope this was a good example for you all to think of all these validity threats and how to increase validity through this example.